Good morning. So, as I said, I'm going to try to share some of these different ideas. So, I was just, I've told you before that I use fountain pens for Carl Jung's active imagination for the I Ching because, again, when I started using the I Ching 30 years ago, I had no idea that Carl Jung used it, but I loved fountain pens as a kid, and when I learned about the fude, which is it just means brush, a fude fountain pen nib could draw these characters, right? It meant I didn't have to use markers anymore. So I watch a number of fountain pen channels. And this morning there was one gentleman who shared architect nibs, which, again, they'd be perfect for drawing Sino-Japanese characters, the Oracle Bone script, or, as I said before, Carl Jung's Red Book was a combination of art, text, So what was funny is this morning, one of the channels that I follow put up a video, and he mentioned that he's being encouraged to put up shorter videos and use simpler language. And what's funny is I've mentioned this before. About 5 years ago, I actually had to begin to learn to read and write. I was able to learn everything I've learned. I was in finance for years, but I had to learn with audiobooks exclusively. I was unable really to. Arguably, what's funny is having worked in finance for 20 years, I only composed maybe a half dozen letters in all that time, and most of the time I actually used an app. Like when I was in mortgages, I had access to an application that actually just auto-filled these letters for me, and I just had to change the date, change the name, and this sort of stuff. So I didn't realize until, and I'm going to explain in this comment that I left, my story and where this came. So yeah, I became a banker. I had all these degrees, but they were specifically only in areas that I could access. I said early on, the CNIB, the Canadian Institute for the Blind, did a lot of audiobooks, and volunteering for them gave you access to the books. And I think they've come to realize that because they had this wealth of audiobooks, they could share that with people that are disabled or people who, blind people, obviously, but people with lower vision. They began to realize that dysgraphia, dyslexia is essentially the same thing. It's just your eyes, your lying eyes, right? That's why I relied so much on audiobooks, right? Because I was able to get the information a lot better. So the gentleman mentioned this, so I'm not going to mention, I'm sorry, I just rambled. So he mentioned that people have short attention spans, so you want to cater to that short attention span. But what he's really saying is on the platform, they care how many minutes of your video a person watches. So if you put up a 3-minute video and they only watch 1 minute, well, then they've watched 1/3 of the video. But if you're like me and put up an hour-long video and they only watch, say, 16 minutes, well, they're only watching, 15%, 10% or something of the video. So it's actually worse for you, even though they're watching 10. Like my numbers are 10x what the average is, right? I have people listening to, they're telling me the average is 35 seconds on some of these videos, for example, right? A couple minutes, and the last video I put up, the average is about 16 minutes that they're listening to in a 54-minute video. And I understand what's going on there because I jump around in some videos. I might come back to a video later, so it's only showing when, like, for example, with me, like if it's an hour long, and that's where these platforms fail. If it's an hour-long video, who's sitting there for an hour and a half and watching it all the way through? Very few. More likely, people are consuming it in bits and bytes. But that's where this metric fails, right? Because when you assume that each time someone comes to watch, that's a different person, then you forget that, yes, I may have come back to the video 3 different times, to finish watching it, but I'm the same person. Same as I've noticed with YouTube sometimes. You have to reload the page. If you leave it in a background tab, well, then that's going to show as two separate people watching the video, right? So I've mentioned this before. It's Campbell's Goodhart's law. Like when the measure becomes the target, the measure is worthless. So in this case, if you're catering to short attention spans, you're failing. Now, the other thing he mentioned is that you want to write for a grade 8 level. And that's a misunderstanding I had myself. I've told you this before. When I began learning how to write, read and write, but write particularly was the toughest for me because I'd never written in my life, really. I started using something called the Hemingway app. And so what that does is it gauges your writing. So what I would do is I'd use social media as a writing prompt, right? Because again, having been sick for 10 years, I didn't have access to, and being Canadian, I didn't have access to some of the resources many other people have. So I just used what I had access to for writing prompts, right? I found out since that there are journals that provide writing prompts, so that's kind of cool. But for me, I used social media, right? If there was an article or an insight, I'd use it to write. And then when I heard about Hemingway app, I took some of my writing, which I have lots of writing. I should actually just put it together. Even though it's terrible, I should put it together into, and that's what I'm trying to learn here. I have a server now, and I have some domain names, and I'm trying to learn how to do that now, too. So not just learn how to write, which I think I've just about gotten to, now learning how to share this stuff. Right? So here is a comment that I left as relates to this, because at one time I would have written this text that I'm going to read. If I had put it into the Hemingway app, it would have rated me, and I'm not kidding, it rated me like grade 17. And the first time I did it, I thought, oh my God, I'm so awesome, I'm so smart, grade 17. But it means that you have to be in grade 17 to be able to read your writing. And I've explained this before. Because of my learning disability, severe dyslexia, dysgraphia, even today, I mentioned I've been using Scribd, the app for books and audiobooks. And I think they think I'm scamming them because I consume 2, 3, 4 books a day now. So I think they think I'm ripping them off because now all of a sudden books that I had access to, like the Skeleton Key to the Finnegan's Wake, the audiobook, that's awesome for me. It was available, and then all of a sudden everything is going to be available once I'm a paid member because I'm in the 30-day free trial. I've considered just ending the trial and paying because it's well worth it, and so I can access all these wonderful books. But we'll see. But Scribd, again, audiobook and book app, wow. It's such an ableist thing if you look at it. I'm not actually making fun, but lowercase b and d, I'm so dyslexic I cannot tell them apart. I've had to memorize, which is how I read, actually. I memorize each word by what it looks like. And you've probably noticed that if I've ever been reading, sometimes I will telegraph, because I read ahead as well. I misread a word because it looks like something else, right? So there was a time I thought, oh my God, you're doing so great, because, I said I was like E.E. Cummings, right? I learned the rules so as to break them, but no, I just applied punctuation willy-nilly, and only I could read. But that's when I realized I needed to do something, because even I had trouble reading my own stuff, right? But as I said, I'd pop my comments into the Hemingway app, and it would say, oh my gosh, you're grade 17 or something like that. And I thought, oh my God, that's so great. Especially when you read what they say. They say grade 17 means you need to be educated to grade the 17 to be able to understand what the person was trying to say. So when they say that on the social media platforms, you should write at a grade 8 level, what that means is you should make it so that it's as simple as possible for people to read, so that they don't have to have high levels of education. So this, it's funny here. So here's an idea. I haven't touched and I haven't tried to simplify anything in the comment because I just literally spit this out moments ago. All I did was clean up my spelling. Didn't touch any of my paragraphs. But I have 539 words. I have 4 adverbs. They want you to aim for 0 or fewer. So honestly, in 539 words, 4 adverbs is pretty good. But I could get it down to less. That's how you simplify the reading. The writing, which I'm going to read, has 5 uses of the passive voice, meeting the goal of 5 or fewer. Right? So I could get rid of a couple of the passive voices. Right? It's use less of the I. I use a lot of I and we. It's just my affect. Then it says 7 phrases have simpler alternatives. Well, yes. I mean, I love to talk silly, and I love the sound of the words. I mean, I endeavor to be a modern philologist, right? Language and classics. So one of 27 sentences is hard to read. I mean, that's amazing if you think about it. In 27 sentences, only one of them is hard to read. And as I said, when I first started this, if I were to put this into the Hemingway app, it would be 27 and 27 were hard to read. And then the final is 5 of 27 sentences are very hard to read. Well, that's pretty much given because I used a lot of brackets and commas, but that's because I'm listing things, right? So it's a little bit in between. But as I said, this is 539 words that I put on social media, and I just popped it into the Hemingway app, which is hemingwayapp.com, and it gave me a readability of grade 9, right? 539 words. So that's fine. Just a couple of paragraphs are tougher to read. And I'll give you a little insight as we go. So, hey, it's actually going to maybe share the Hemingway app, which I've used to teach myself, because I used Grammarly and I found it corrected, but didn't really help you learn how to write and use grammar, whereas I find Hemingway app really does help. So this is what I wrote about someone doing a review of a fountain pen, but specifically said he's doing shorter videos because he's been told they need to do shorter videos. And to write, and I guess what he means is script, should be at a grade 8 level. And so here we go. So this is what I'm about to read is technically at a grade 9, listed as a good. So again, if I were to minimize the hard-to-read sentences, phrases that have simpler alternatives, I would be grade 5. I can get her down to grade 5 or 6. But that being said, the reason why you want to be at grade 8 or 9 is not because most people are at that education level, but the real reason is most people don't want to put in too much higher order thinking to be able to read something, right? So they may be at a grade 12 level reading if they're activated and focused. But if they're just reading passively, it's got to be much simpler. But here's my response to encouraging people to have an even shorter attention span and not challenge them on their reading and comprehension. So as I say, and here I go, a quote. You know as well as I that catering to short attention spans will only lead to shorter spans. With reading, and I love that, because remember, span is also like something that connects or disconnects, right? Because the span is the distance between. But it also can be what connects, but neither here nor there. So you know as well as I that catering to short attention spans will only lead to shorter spans. With reading, as with children, we should always be challenging the reader, just above their skill level, so they are encouraged to grow. I liken it to my early education. They assumed a dyslexic, dysgraphic student could not learn as a typical could. And in brackets I put, there is only atypical minds. And that's something I've talked about in previous podcasts, that we need to realize that no two people are alike, so no two ways to learn. And I continue. I say, thus, never learning to overcome their limitations, right? Because they teach people with learning disabilities that they can't overcome it. They're going to have to work around it rather than working around it until you can overcome it. The truth is anything is possible, within reason, if we believe in ourselves. We are either learning or winning, growing or shrinking, atrophy. I was told that French immersion was contraindicated for learning disabilities. And just as a side note, because I was so severely dyslexic, but very verbal, they missed it for years. And so I ended up falling between the cracks, as it were. Right? So they told me because of the French immersion, I shouldn't have been put in it, and that's what would keep me from being able to go to college, because it made my dyslexia worse, because I had to learn in French. But, so I continue on. I have multiple degrees, almost exclusively self-directed, and learned not just one additional language, but have learned to translate multiple languages so as to read books in the original. Well, the reason why I mention this is what most people talk about, how amazing James Joyce was, because not only was he trained in the classics, he himself, like I, went and studied Greek on his own, became very proficient. But most importantly, the story that people talk about is him learning Norwegian so he could read and communicate in letters with Henrik Ibsen. And the reason why I chuckle is there's a politician who's saying he learned Norwegian so he could read a book, and I just chuckle, right? Because being trained in classics and being a big fan of James Joyce, I knew right away that's just a bold-faced lie, because never once has this politician ever talked about right? For me, I learned to translate German because I adore Nietzsche. I've read everything Nietzsche has ever written so many times I could probably never count. And I'm even including his journals and all this jazz. Right? So for me, it opened it up further. Same as the Chinese Book of Change. Right? I wanted to learn to read into the characters so I could learn the meaning. Right? I've talked about this before, that I'm a fan of sumo. And even within the Japanese culture, they say hakioi, and they think it just means something to do with sumo. I've mentioned this before with basho. Basho is place, but more commonly understood as the tournament for sumo, but it's much deeper than that. Hakioi actually means your best chance, like good luck, but a propitious opportunity. It goes back to the Chinese Book of Change, because the character that is pronounced hake in Japan is bagua in the Chinese, which actually is referring to the hexagrams of the Chinese Book of Change. So it's talking about propitious or destiny. Right? But this has been lost to history. Right? But I'll continue on. So I've translated the Zen Sutra from Chinese into English for the first time in history. And again, as I said, this politician's never mentioned why he learned. Why did I want to translate this? Not so that I can go around and saying, hey, well, I did this a couple of years ago and I've never mentioned it, so it's not for ego. I translated because I found out, hey, there's this Zen Sutra called Sutra of Zen Sickness, or I can't remember exactly how I translated the title, but that's what they were talking about. It was talking about healing Zen sickness, as it were. And so, of course, I wanted to read it and found out that there was no translation available. So I translated it myself, right? And I was right. The illness that plagues the Zennies, right? And so it's probably why it's never been translated, because it actually chides the practitioners for having lost the goal, right? So that's why I learned to translate Chinese, not just to read into the characters, but more importantly so that I could read the content of these books. Not so that I could say I've read this book or say I've translated, but I wanted to know what the book said, right? Same as James Joyce. He adored Ibsen, so he wanted to read it in the original language, and he became such a fan he wanted to correspond with him. So there's a reason why. But when someone says they speak a language or they learn a language and there isn't a reason behind it, you have to question that, right? I mentioned before about there was some American presidents who have claimed they spoke French, but if you've heard them, oh boy, no. Most certainly not. But I go on and I say that I translated Nietzsche, or I've translated Nietzsche's work so as to show his true meaning and intention. I've talked about this before. It's a common misunderstanding to the lay people, it seems. Most scholars understand Nietzsche's will to power, Willenmacht, is related to, Schopenhauer and, it's really related to a lot of people before, but this idea of intention. I mean, will, intention, motivation, even your action, in a sense. So what powers your will, what powers your desire, what powers your goals, your actions, right? Macht in German being more propel than power. Power as in like a power plant, not power as in power over others, right? That is an affect that people will do to get a sense of control to their lives. But Nietzsche spoke on this. That's not a true control. It's a cope, right? So as I said, if you've learned to translate a book, why? Right? Because you should, as I said, if you have put the time in to learn another language because you wanted to read this book, then you should be able to tell me what you loved about that book in English and why you wanted to read it in its native tongue, right? So, and I say, when I continue on, right, is true meaning and intention, which I said is to empower us to find meaning and value in life. And I continue, and my studies of the Chinese Book of Change has led to a deeper understanding of the characters that multiple languages are based on. I mentioned that before, about Hakioi, Basho, which was a term used by the Kyoto school that was trying to, they say blend or what have you, but just to show the synergy, in my opinion, between Zen philosophy and Nietzsche. Nietzsche's philosophy is heavily influenced by the same philosophy that influenced Zen, so it's not a surprise. But I continue on, and I say that, plus, we are opening up the practices Carl Jung used to write and heal with his red book. That's the Liber Novus. None of this was considered possible. It all began when my doctor told me he had exhausted all avenues to heal. It began when my doctor told me he had exhausted all avenues to heal an autoinflammatory disease. I was left to learn, to read, and to use a computer so I could read the studies and the research as relates to my autoinflammatory disease. As a result, the disease that had either pills or surgery for treatment alone, that's the only options there were, now has the diet and lifestyle that has shown the most benefits, which was an opinion that had me banned from groups for even suggesting. Zinc, from a study that doctors ignored for years, not only for inflammation, but also for immune, right? So zinc supplementation can help both people suffering from autoimmune disease and autoinflammatory disease. But this is something that doctors weren't recommending when I began healing my disease. It's only been something that's become part of the zeitgeist in the last couple of years. And I found that paper on zinc, almost 10 years ago now. So not only for inflammation, but also for immune, and allergies and food sensitivities are a much broader issue than we ever assumed, right? This is a big deal that most people don't understand. I go on and say, recent examples have shown how much I have learned. I discovered diamine oxidase for use with my allergies and inflammation. It's for fighting, not fighting. It helps manage histamine. And I go on. I found it from a study on Tulsi, which is holy basil. I applied it to a related plant. In this case happens to be mint. I've done this for years, using mint as an antihistamine, anti-inflammatory, and I've said this in my podcast many times. My social media, I've shared, it's years I've been using the mint. And I go on and say, only last year, has a doctor published a book about DAO for inflammation and histamine. And in brackets I put his mast cell sensitivity. And just to let you know that when I first mentioned this belief that my inflammation is tied to my severe allergies, my histamine, maybe even some mast cell sensitivity, my doctor laughed at me. Same as he laughed at me a few years before that when I suggested that I needed to find a replacement for histamine, antihistamines, because it was messing with my microbiome. In fact, I told him how important the microbiome was, and I brought in an empty pill bottle because I explained that it's not just probiotics and prebiotics, but it's a multi-spectrum that's required to help with mood, with the microbiome. It produces all your neurotransmitters, and it helps with inflammation. He laughed at me with that as well. And I had to tell him, aren't you going to mark down the... And so he wrote it down, just, I guess, to shut me up. Proof positive later, because he totally forgot that we discovered I was allergic to PEG, and he had forgotten about that. I mean, that's a big deal, because I told him how I had to find an alternative source of toothpaste and an alternative source of deodorant, because it was actually causing a severe reaction, a noticeable reaction. And if I hadn't begun to eliminate all sorts of other issues and begun to heal my microbiome and consumed all that mint so I could put got mast cell in check and manage my histamine, it wasn't until I did that I was able to notice that a particular, and actually it wasn't until I had the money to be able to buy better deodorant. And it wasn't until I noticed that when I used this deodorant, it caused a reaction. When I used this one, I didn't. And then what I noticed is, oh, lo and behold, one has PEG and another did not. And, right? Down that whole rabbit hole, I've even eliminated some other chemicals, because once I eliminated that, I noticed some other issues in different areas, right? So this is why I've said the most important thing is agency in healing. You need to be your advocate and your healer, right? But I carry on, and I quote, only last year, a doctor has published a book about DAO for inflammation and histamine, as well as the mast cell sensitivity. But they recommend pea shoots for the DAO source. This is a much lower concentration than mint or tulsi. I mean, it's right in the data. And it's much harder to grow for oneself and to consume. My solution was to make tea all day. Replace water with mint tea. Can't get any easier. I mean, you can grow mint a lot easier than pea shoots. Or just, you can buy mint tea almost anywhere. Pea shoots, not. I was buying them in the store, but trust me, the amount of mint tea that you can consume compared to pea shoots, never mind pea shoots, they really are sensitive to, right? You got to buy them and eat them within a couple days, or you got to grow them and be planning arguably a week or two in advance to make sure you have enough for every day. Whereas my mint tea, even during the lockdowns and all of the borders being shut down, I mean, I was still able to access mint tea. It wasn't the really good organic that I really like, but I was still able to get a mint tea. So I go on. I said, this is a pretty big deal, since inflammation is the next major issue of our times, and mood issues. Right? So I said, from the mouths of babes, this idea that, amateurs, right? This is a lesson of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Not just that amateurs think they are experts, but the hubris of the experts are as much a risk to the pursuit of knowledge. As C.S. Peirce said, doubt is the first rule of logic. And I paraphrase Nietzsche. Specialists are a risk to society. We need more masters of none, so we do not have people with giant ears to hear, but without eyes to see or mouths to speak. Right? That's what I wrote. So that's my insight, as I said here. I don't know what I did. I actually took out a sentence that wasn't supposed to be in it, and it made it grade 10. Right? But what's funny is it's really not that hard. Watch, you can really just put a period here, or change a word. Oh, watch. So I can just take out one word. Yeah, it doesn't take a lot to change. So that was what I wanted to share. The idea that beliefs, either instilled by others, institutions, or even one's own, those are the true limiting beliefs. I mean, I'm not going to go so far as a Sartre or Foucault to say that you can invent anything you want, right? But there is a case to be made that, well, I liken it to placebo. If you believe in the potential of any protocol that's been proven by healing, anything they test, you get about 30% of people will see benefits from it just because they believe in it. So it's a combination of placebo, that's about 20%, plus the buying in. I mentioned this with the doctor who just recently wrote about psychedelics in a couple of different books and doesn't understand it. Because it's not the psychedelics that's the healing. It's the buying in. It's the belief that it's going to help. Right? I mean, we've shown this in studies that you can give someone a sugar pill, and it works. But you know what works even better? Give them something that will give them some sort of indication that they took something. The common thing is niacin. If you give somebody niacin, they'll actually notice, flushing of the skin, the tingling, that sort of stuff. I get jumpy and fidgety and stuff. That has shown itself to be an incredible boon to healing, right? I mean, I've talked about this before. Believe it or not, we're predisposed to heal if we consume a medicine that is bitter. It's really quite weird. It's because most medicines are bitter, but at the same time, so are many poisons. But I mean, the difference between medicine and poison is in the dose. So there's an argument to be made, like, how much of just the bitter perception of a compound plays into the healing, right? Because if everything's on a spectrum, and we could see it this way, depending on how bitter a medicine is, either dictates the amount of healing or maybe even one step further, how poisonous it may be. But that's all I wanted to share. Just a little bit of an insight as to where I come from. I began studying Buddhism when I was young because, as I said, they told me to go into something different. They didn't think philosophy and that sort of stuff would be for me. I tried to get into the Royal Military College here in Canada. I wanted to be a peacekeeper. I wanted to save lives, is really what I wanted to do. But because my marks weren't 94% or above, I didn't get in. I was invited to join the infantry, but you can imagine what I thought of that. See, my father was an enlisted man, hated officers, and my grandfather was an officer, and my father hated him. So it was a weird dynamic. Needless to say, I wanted to go in as an officer, not because of the family dynamic, but because I felt they needed, well, actually that's going to be my next podcast. I'm going to talk about peace and war, right? And stated intentions, right? I think the next podcast I'm going to do, I'm just going to share, again, like I said before, perspectives in statistics and propaganda. In this case, it's sheer propaganda that's risking global war, which is sad. But I bid you adieu, and thank you for your time, and have a wonderful day.